This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
This is In Focus, and I am Anupama Chandrasekaran. Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal, is a vibrant and historic hub nestled in a valley surrounded by the Himalayas. But on 8th September, the same streets, usually alive with temples, markets, and festivals, were overtaken by anger and grief. Protests against corruption after a sudden ban on 26 social media platforms swept through the city. By nightfall, police had opened fire. 19 people were dead and more than 100 injured. The next day, the anger turned into flames. Party offices, ministers' homes, even the parliament were attacked. Helicopters evacuated leaders. By afternoon, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigned. The army was sent in to restore order. The fuel was corruption, inequality, and a generation that really sees little future at home. Nepalis had been watching their neighbors, Sri Lanka in 2022 and Bangladesh in 2024, and asking, really, when will it be our turn? To understand how Nepal got here and where it may be headed, I'm joined by Roman Gautam, editor of Himal Southasian, a magazine that has told South Asia's political and cultural stories across borders for over 3 decades. Hello, Roman, and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you so much, Anu. It's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Roman, before we begin, could you introduce yourself and tell us what it's also been like to witness these extraordinary, really crazy events unfold in Kathmandu?
Well, yeah, as you said, my name is Roman Gautam. I was brought up in Kathmandu. I live here, and I run this magazine, a regional magazine of South Asian politics and culture. And of course, the big story that we are also keeping our eyes on right now, as I think all of the region is what's been happening here in Kathmandu. Things have been moving extremely fast. I think all of us are still reeling and trying to process. I think, even last night, I think like many other Nepalis, I think I was struggling to sleep, just trying to make sense of the day's events. I live not too far from one of the places that was really targeted by the protesters yesterday, the ministerial quarters, where you had helicopters flying in and evacuating the ministers, and afterwards a lot of arson, a lot of looting. But that's of course just one small part of the picture. This is something that was happening across so much of the city. I think, like many Nepalis, I was processing and receiving a lot of the information on social media, and through what friends and others were passing around on WhatsApp and on Viber and on everything else. So it's, I think, a lot of information. I think more than even if you had been out there on the streets yourself. I think just the amount of information that's being hurled at us, and of course also no small amount of disinformation out there as well. So I think right now it's just the day when things seem to be a little bit quieter here in Kathmandu now, and I think all of Nepal is just trying to catch its breath and start thinking about what comes next.
You'd mentioned earlier when we were kind of chatting about how it's kind of a change of role for you, right? Because usually you're the editor who's editing stories, and here you're actually in the thick of the news, which was basically the last straw, seemed to be this ban on 26 social media platforms, right? For a country where young people depend on those platforms, to do a lot of things and to protest, to organize, what did that ban symbolize, and how did it shape the mood leading into the demonstrations?
Yeah, I think that that's something that's important to look at, and a small correction, I think, to maybe a lot of the perception and a lot of the coverage that's also coming out. The social media ban was certainly part of the picture, but there's a lot of coverage that makes it seem as if all of this happened in response to the social media ban, and that was really the only thing almost that was driving all of the protests. And I think that that's very inaccurate, and I think important to understand. the social media ban, I won't go into all the details, but the process behind that had been kind of moving along independently of any of the protests for quite some time. And the fact that it happened right as the protests were also coming together, in some ways, is a quirk of timing. What there had been, I think, more importantly, is a growing upswell, especially among young people, among Gen Z, on social media about nepotism. There was a movement online where young people were seeing a lot of, I guess, the children of politicians and political leaders, and seeing the kinds of lifestyles and the kind of wealth that they were showing on social media. The questions that started to come up were ones of, again, nepotism, corruption. That's what gave the initial impetus to young people to organize these protests. And then, of course, the social media ban, when it came along at more or less the same time, you were asking what it symbolized. I think that it symbolized for young people a government that had very little concern to consult them or to think about what a ban on social media platforms would mean. And so I think that the social media ban, I think, just heightened the sense of a government that was very much out of touch and very much felt like it could act without having to think about the consequences of what it was doing for the citizens that it was meant to represent. And I think that that's kind of the pattern, with the nepotism and with everything else that people were also complaining about. I think that's probably the big picture pattern that was playing out here. I think the overall sense here was of a system that had, and an elite that had become so arrogant as to think that nothing it did would ever have any consequences for it, and so felt like it could act without any sense of responsibility. And I think that the social media ban coming when it did really also just reinforced that sense. And of course, it served to add fuel to the fire. Though I do think it's important to understand that the bans themselves were not the primary fuel of the fire at all.
And again, just to kind of give context, all this is in the background of, poverty rates being really high. When you're talking about the elite and the kind of wealth they accumulated, more than, 20% of the population, the poverty rate is at 20% in Nepal, right? Which means 1 in 4 people are below the poverty line. And our youth unemployment is a huge challenge. I mean, we see all around us, a lot of Nepalese coming to work in India. And like you rightly pointed out, even in your article this morning, these are difficult jobs. These are not fancy jobs. They are leading difficult lives away from family and things like that, right? And also, I think the fact that Transparency International also rated Nepal as one of the most corrupt countries, right? So we're talking about this wealth accumulation in the background of all these facts, which obviously kind of triggered a huge wave of anger amongst the citizens.
Absolutely, and you were mentioning that piece, which I pretty much stayed up overnight to write, and I think by way of writing, process some of what has been happening. For anyone who's curious to read more, that piece is available at www.himalmag.com with much more explanation and context and detail. But yeah, no, I think the themes that you were raising. You were talking about high rates of poverty. I think, as I say in my article, Nepal has made actually progress in, let's say, the last 2 decades, kind of the post-Civil War phase of Nepal's national life. But the thing is that a lot of that progress has really come despite the government rather than because of it. And I think that people are very clear there, right? You were talking about high migration rates. And yes, I mean, we have 800,000 people leaving the country every year to work abroad. And that is in the context of a population very, very roughly of 30 million people. And you can imagine what that means in terms of the number of people of working age who are going abroad and what that says about the kind of future or lack of future that people and an opportunity that people see here. You were also mentioning youth unemployment. And in many ways, I think that the fact that we have so many Nepalese going abroad, so many young Nepalese going abroad, was in many ways actually acting kind of like a safety valve, right? I think that a lot of the dysfunction in the government was being papered over almost by the fact that a lot of the people working abroad were sending and continue to send um, large remittances home. And for most Nepali families, I think it is safe to say their only source of hope and of uplift is these remittances that are coming back from abroad. And those remittances are also in many ways helping to prop up the country's economy. They've raised standards of living, certainly. And I think that it's important to recognize that Nepal has, even the government, made small, perhaps, or very frustratingly slow, perhaps is the best way to put it, steps in the right direction over those 2 decades. But corruption was and remains massive and endemic. People are sick and tired of that. And I think that, in many ways, people, this generation, especially because of what progress there has been, this generation, I think, is much more exposed to the world. Part of that is social media. Part of that, I think, is also just Nepal's exposure to the rest of the world via mass labor migration and just so many Nepalis being abroad. And I think that there's also now a shift in expectations of what the government should be doing. I think that people were fed up of this notion that the government could do whatever it wanted and the people would just quietly take it, which has been true for for extensive periods of Nepali history. Not all the time. I think that this is another thing that I touch upon in the piece. This is not the first time that Nepalis have taken to the streets to really engineer a popular, well, revolution, if you want to call it that. I think in this case, so far at least, there is no talk of overturning the system of government, but certainly in terms of getting rid of not just a government, but an entire political class and a desire to really rewrite the rules of power wholesale.
Taking on from what you're just saying, if you look at the protests that began on September 8th, they were officially approved, right? This was Hami Nepal, that was what it was called, and was largely peaceful. Yet within hours, barricades were breached, police fired live rounds, dozens of people were killed. How did the situation spiral so fast? And what stood out to you about the way, security forces responded?
I think that I'm not entirely sure whether there was official permission or not. I'm sorry, I just haven't followed that particular thread very closely. I do know, and I wasn't there when all of that happened, but of course, I, like millions of other Nepalis, saw the aftermath of it on social media, and the aftermath was really horrific. I think that from reports from people who were there, what seems to have happened is that the protesters moved towards Parliament. A lot of the protesters were, when we say Gen Z, these really are, and I use the term respectfully, kids. They were very much their first time organizing a protest, their first time making political demands in this way. And the protest moved towards Parliament. And it seems like at some point, as so often with these kinds of protests, there were also some more, let's say, aggressive elements that mixed in. A lot of this, I think, would have been just other young people, maybe not Gen Z necessarily, in the sense of people who are maybe a lot of them in their teenage years, probably were also part of the protest turning more aggressive. This was happening at this point around the Parliament building. Exactly what happens, all of those details will need to be sifted very carefully. I'm sure, well, there should be investigations into exactly what happened. But at some point, the security forces start firing tear gas, rubber bullets, it seems also live rounds. And how that escalation happened so quickly, I think all of us were just really, really shocked by it and are still trying to understand. I think that, not so long ago, and you might remember this from the headlines, there were pro-monarchy protests in Kathmandu as well, also quite large ones. And there was also violence there. The crowd did turn violent. There were sadly some lives lost. But there was not this level of direct violence by state and security forces against the protesters. There's a extremely graphic video of a young boy bleeding out from a head wound, and clearly has been shot, and many more like that. So, I think that the context here became, where did that order come from? Who thought that they could behave in this way? And why against kids? A lot of people, naturally, a lot of parents, I think, are thinking that could have been my kid, because that day a lot of the kids who went to those protests didn't tell their parents. I've been hearing stories about how kids would, they would dress in school uniform and head to school, and then with all of their friends, they were like, "No, we're going to skip school today." It was a Monday morning. They just decided to skip school and head to the protest because they thought that that's the more important or the more interesting place for them to be. And so you had, parents who said sent their kids off to school in the morning, and by evening they had news that their children had been killed, shot by state forces. And I think that is where the depth of the shock really starts to set in.
Yeah, no, I mean that's crazy and kind of in some ways is revealed, right, in the kind of anger that was directed not just at the police by the protesters, right? We saw buildings burned, homes of former prime ministers attacked. I think a former prime minister's wife died of burn wounds. That was crazy to read about. Ministers airlifted out of government offices. You said that wasn't very far away from your home. What does this level of fury against the political class tell us where public trust stands today? You spoke about pro monarchy protest as well, which we were talking about a few years ago, which, basically the protesters were demanding the restoration of monarchy in Nepal, right? Like, where is the public trust? I mean, this is crazy that to hear that young school children who actually went out to protest have been killed, and then of course subsequently seeing all this kind of violence start in this little Himalayan town.
I think Kathmandu on certain days does feel like a little Himalayan town. I think yesterday it certainly felt like a raging, raging city. You were talking about the pro monarchy protests, which were significant, but I think a lot of that was perhaps overplayed in the international coverage. I think that anything to do with Nepal and the monarchy, because of some old Orientalist and other ideas, really plays well. So I think that the scale of the call for the monarchy to come back was overplayed in the international media. But that said, I think that there were many factors behind those protests. But again, that was already a sign of deep-seated anger and deep-seated disillusionment with the current political system.
How was it for you? You mentioned earlier to me that you were kind of very close to this neighborhood where ministers were being airlifted out of government offices. You saw the plumes of black smoke kind of emerge into the sky.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you describe these things for us and give us a sense of how what the mood was in the city the last few days?
Absolutely. I think that so it wasn't government offices, but these were ministerial quarters, not very far from where I live. I did not have direct line of sight. I had been in that vicinity earlier in the day, before the helicopters started flying in. Um, the crowds gathered, and I think by morning yesterday, anything to do with both the government but also the political establishment, as it is popularly perceived, suddenly became fair game. The ministerial quarters were pretty much besieged by the crowd. And I think that the mood was getting angrier and angrier. At that point, the prime minister had not resigned. I think that that was the main demand, but anger was really building, and people were, I think, targeting the ministerial quarters here, because in this part of the city, that's probably the clearest symbol of the government and of the political establishment. And so I think important to understand here also that these protests and everything that's happening now is not just targeted at a particular party or at the government that has now come down. It is really targeted at the whole political system and the political establishment, oftentimes very indiscriminate ways. And I think that's why so many of the horrific scenes of destruction that we witnessed yesterday. At the ministerial quarters, I had come back home by the time the helicopters started flying in, but I was on the roof of my home alongside neighbors. The entire neighborhood was up on their roofs watching, first one thin plume of smoke that kept getting thicker. Then the helicopter, starting with an army helicopter, started to circle overhead. Before long, they were touching down at the ministerial kind of the complex of the ministerial quarters. And there were several helicopters that were just taking turns to land and ferry people out. Afterwards, yeah, the plumes of smoke get thicker and taller. From my neighborhood, you could see other plumes of smoke rising from elsewhere in the bowl of the Kathmandu Valley. Once the helicopters had flown out, gunshots, I think, warning protesters. I don't know. We don't have clear information at this point if there were any casualties around the ministerial quarters, at least that I'm aware of. I might be wrong on that. And at some point, I think the quarters just are set alight. And I think that minus the helicopter airlift, those are scenes that repeated themselves in so many different places in Kathmandu. There were some restrictions on movement yesterday after the events of 8 September. And I think that what that meant was that a lot of people were taking their anger to the doorstep of whatever symbol of power was closest to them in their various parts of the city. And important here to also emphasize that it was not just Kathmandu. This is something that happened across the entire country. The same way that in Kathmandu, people were looking around their neighborhoods and seeing where to turn their anger. Across the country, in cities and towns, big and small, you had very similar things. And today as well, the curfews. Yesterday's destruction, today's curfew. All of that is very much a nationwide phenomenon.
Subsequently, like you said, the prime minister did resign. You saw other ministers resign. And a lot of attention has then turned to Rabi Lamichane. Is that the right way to pronounce his name?
That is it. Yes, that's close.
And you've explained that he's a television anchor turned politician, and of course, I read a lot about Balan Shah as well, rapper turned mayor of Kathmandu. What does their rise tell us about the kind of leadership Gen Z is looking for? You obviously, in your article, spoke about things that doesn't really paint them in a completely great light, right? They have their failings as well. So tell us a little bit about Rabi Lamichane and Balan Shah, and whether you believe this is the kind of leadership that is something that Nepal should vie for.
So I think rather than belief, I think that I'm going to stick to the grounds of what factually I think is already clear on both of them, and I think that there's a lot of unknowns around them. They are both very new to power, and exactly how they will behave in power. I think chances are that they will be able, or yeah, that they will have a chance to show Nepalis in the coming months, years, who knows. But I think a couple of important things to note about both of them. I think that important to rewind by a couple of years when both of them were elected. Balincha as the mayor of Kathmandu, Robi Lamisane as a parliamentarian. He, in mid 2022, founds a new political party, and within months in the national election, they take roughly 10% of the vote, which is a massive, massive surprise. Because the old political parties are quite complacent, quite happy to, quite content to just keep doing the same things over and over and take the vote for granted. And I think that that really was maybe, in many ways, a landmark on the way to where we are now. The fact that Robi Laminsani's party received such a large share of the vote so quickly, and also that also in the same year, Balinsha dominates a municipal election in Kathmandu against two candidates of the establishment parties, in this case the CPN-UML and the Nepali Congress, was already basically a sign of a big protest vote. I think that a lot of people were just using their vote to say enough of the old ways, enough of taking us for granted, enough of not delivering what a government is expected to deliver. And also, I think the other side of this is that both of them were able to leverage social media and the online discourse in a way that the old parties really were not. And a lot of their support was coming, Balincha was elected in Kathmandu. A lot of the support for Rabi Lamitsani's party was coming from from urban Nepal as well. And I think that that was another sign that the old parties were kind of losing the plot in a way, because the plot was moving online. And these were the new forces that were coming up online, really using those platforms for communication and organization, and clearly allied with public sentiment that was really against, and an upswell of public sentiment against the older parties, able to translate that into very solid electoral numbers. And in both their cases, they did get a chance to be in office. In Rabi Lamithane's case, relatively briefly, he had a short and tumultuous stint as a minister and with his party as part of the government right after that national election, before there was a fallout and Rabi Lamithani was subsequently put in jail. And with Balin, he has remained the mayor of Kathmandu. And I think since these, I think, are two names that the world will be hearing a lot more in the context of Nepal, I think important to look at what we can see from their time in office. With Balensha, there's been a huge amount of administrative dysfunction, and I think the really his greatest accomplishment is really his online following. I think what he has been able to accomplish in terms of the perception of him among young people and online, I think is far larger than the reality, and I think very clearly the failings of his administration as a mayor. So I think that is cause for concern, because I think right now Nepalis are in, and especially young Nepalis are in the on a search for saviors. And of course, you don't want to go to the old faces, you want to look to the new faces. But I think that with the new faces as well, um, we have to be sober, even if this moment it is difficult for a lot of people to be sober about where we go next. And I think that there is a danger that we again recreate the same old systems with new faces. I know that, and I think that with both Ravi Lamishane and with Balin Shah, they are promising to change things, and they deserve that chance if that is what they are promising, and if through a democratic process they are given the mandate to try their hand at government, they absolutely deserve the chance to change the system and to do things differently and to change Nepali politics in the ways that they have been promising, because both of them have been complaining about the system very very vocally as well. But if you look at the pattern of Nepali history, we've had so many cases where the new guys reproduce a lot of the sins of the old guys. Even the people right now who are being booted out of power were once all of them on the streets protesting against, back in the day it would be the monarchy, and the failure of that government, and its inability to deliver justice and fairness for the people of Nepal. So the danger is of history repeating itself. Though, of course, we hope that maybe this time Nepal can engineer a different outcome. But I think we have to be really sober and not fall for this savior thinking.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the usage of social media by both these new politicians, right? Or politicians who are being looked up to, Rabi and Balin, because and like you again rightly pointed out, there's both good and bad of that. Through social media, there's obviously a perception that they become really sharp at creating, which may be far flung from reality. And of course we know that even the social media giants are kind of familiar with this power that they have, right? Even with Facebook, to actually gather people for protests and things like that, which is great. But there is also this problem where perceptions can be far larger than the reality, which is, I think, an important point that you brought out. And yeah, hopefully a change will come soon, and perhaps in the right direction. If you are looking at the protesters, school children, college students, young people, they are demanding property disclosures. They actually have like a clear set of demands in a way, right? They're talking about families of politicians disclosing what property they own, even kind of stating what property they owned before they actually became elected and after they got elected. They're talking about consequences for corruption, a break from leaders who have ruled for decades, right? Do you see this movement as part of the larger wave of youth led uprisings we've seen in South Asia? Or do you feel Nepal is charting something different?
I think, yeah, a very complex question with a very complex answer, I think, in this case. One thing I can say for sure is that when the Argalaya happened in Sri Lanka a few years ago, when the Rajapaksa regime was removed, forced out, Nepalis who usually do not pay attention to Sri Lankan politics really did take notice. I remember a few conversations in Kathmandu with various people where people were like, "Oh, they just did this." I think in Sri Lanka it was perhaps the first time that the people had kind of risen that way to force a government out of power. Nepal does have some prior experience with this kind of thing, but still,
Just to give context, you're talking about Aragalaya, which was the mass protest movement in Sri Lanka in 2022, right? Asking President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's
correct.
resignation amidst the economic crisis. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. So yeah, I think that when people here saw another country rise up against a government that had completely failed them, they did take notice. And then last year, Bangladesh, the uprising there against the government of Sheikh Hasina, and so many years of brutal oppression and authoritarianism. Once again, I remember conversations in here in Kathmandu with a few people where people are again taking notice and kind of saying, you know, our turn will also come because we also have the same frustrations. I think that Nepalis were seeing themselves and their problems and their anger and their frustrations in Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans and really taking note. And when they were saying that sooner or later maybe it will come to the same thing here, that's kind of what this moment now is. And I think that there is, of course, the temptation to see all of this as interlinked. Of course, I'm sure there will be people who are spinning conspiracy theories about some foreign hand. I really don't think that any of that is true here. But certainly, people were taking some inspiration from these things, and also from the protests underway right now in Indonesia. I think that also factored into this. So I think that in that way, there are similarities in terms of populations who are sick and tired of mismanagement and misgovernment, and are saying, enough, we have to change. But there are also, let's say, and maybe those are the positive similarities. I think there are also negative similarities. The negative similarities, of course, very sadly and tragically, in all the death and destruction that has accompanied a lot of these changes. The mob really devastating Kathmandu. So many government buildings set alight yesterday. People being beaten on the streets, ministers included, which was really, really devastating to see. But I think Bangladesh also, the mobs ran free for a good amount of time in the wake of Sheikh Hasina's fall. So there are negative, I think, similarities of that nature also. But I think that the big question facing all of these places now comes back to what you started your question with: corruption. Right? I think that more than anything else, more than the social media ban, it is that question: corruption, and how the hell do we control it? Which I think is now dominating all three countries. In Sri Lanka, recently there was the arrest of former president and prime minister Ranil Wickremesinghe.
Vikramasinghe. Yeah.
Exactly, on corruption charges. But I think that beyond that, a lot of Sri Lankans have been quite disappointed to see that the new government of the JVP, the leftist party, very much not part of the regime that was booted out during the Aragalaya, they were expecting more. I think that the promises there were of much more serious scrutiny and consequences for corruption, and really much stronger mechanisms to see that it does not happen again. And I think a lot of people in Sri Lanka have been disappointed by the slow pace of progress on this. With Bangladesh, now that you have the interim government under Muhammad Yunus, following on from the Sheikh Hasina regime and its massive corruption and abuses. Again, you have a government that is really, really struggling to change. In Bangladesh, I think they really are. The interim government has tried; it has tried hard, but it is so hard to change and shift some of the old patterns and some of the old systems. I think that in Nepal, you know, we are probably entering into a very similar struggle. How do we really change politics in a way that works for the people? I think that we need to be looking very hard at the past and really understanding what has been tried and what has failed. And most often, what has happened in Nepal is that new faces come in, but then either quickly or gradually the old systems reassert themselves with new faces, sometimes with new forms. But fundamentally, the political system remains one that is geared towards the interest of an establishment and an elite, and is not taking the decisions and looking at the interests that are most important to make sure that the vast majority of Nepalis have a better country to live in and have better lives while they are here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us today, and kind of being the eyes on the streets of Kathmandu for us, to just get an understanding of the weight and urgency of what's happening with this people's struggle. So thank you so much, and I look forward to being in touch and seeing what happens next, and hopefully things are going to get better from here on. So thank you, Roman, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for helping us keep the eyes of the world on Nepal as well. I think that that will be important no matter what happens next.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.